Hey, Commissioner Coy, how are you?
Hello, doing well. Happy
Good.
Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday. Hello, Commissioner Esposito, how are you?
Good.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I'm excited. It's Tuesday. So I think we've got a pretty good agenda here this afternoon. So we've got two policies in particular to cover, so ethics and compensation. We have one item for compliance reports this afternoon, and then I want to make sure we have time to cover public comment. Is Chief Sivan here representing management? All right. I always feel in good hands. All right.
I thought you were on vacation though.
2 cents?
I am here, not on vacation for these purposes, to both represent and also to present, along with Tanisha, the policy on ethics.
Well, thank you. I'll just put it that way. I'll put it, thank you for doing it.
All right. Well, without further ado, so that Chief Simmons can get to vacation, why don't we allow him to get started on BCA for ethics?
Sure. And I don't see Ms. Moore on, but I'll start.
I'm here. Hello,
Oh,
everyone.
great.
Apologies. I was finishing up a call with our chair, but yes, I am here. Good evening, everyone.
So we've been hard at work on our updates to our Code of Ethics BCA. And just as an overview, this policy is the policy of the board, which really requires designated employees to disclose their financial affairs and sets minimum standards on ethical conduct, really to guard against improper influence for the board or city schools. There are a number of key features of this policy. Setting out an overview, it establishes an ethics panel, which is a group of citizens appointed by the board to provide guidance on ethics issues. It sets up a detailed set of financial disclosure requirements that board members and the CEO and other school leaders are required to annually submit. It establishes rules for conflict of interest, including rules on what gifts are acceptable and what are not. It talks about using and disclosing confidential information and the prohibitions on that. And also really goes to not just issues that create improprieties, but also the appearance of impropriety. And that could include, and this is the last key term, the idea of prestige of office, that the misuse of the prestige of your office could be an ethics violation. So those are the overviews. So what are our goals in updating this policy? The Maryland State Ethics Commission has established model guidance and had some state law updates. Here, we are not subject to the Maryland State Ethics Commission directly, meaning that our own ethics panel issues its decisions and those aren't reviewed by the Maryland State Ethics Commission, but, and this is important, but the State Ethics Commission is required to review and approve all school board ethics policies and then any revisions to them. Not to bury the lead, but as we'll talk about a little bit later, we've actually submitted a draft of what we've submitted to you in the policy committee for the ethics panel's initial take. And after some feedback, they have approved the versions that we're submitting to you, which is good news. And of course, if the board has any further tweaks, we can bring them back to the State Ethics Commission. Another key goal, in addition to updates to state law and guidance, is that there are a couple of tweaks that we need to make to address elected board commissioners now that we have two, including Commissioner Esposito here. And we also have a student commissioner with expanded voting rights. Also, there have been some questions about the ethics panel. Sometimes things come to the ethics panel in advisory opinions where the ethics panel identifies a conflict. And then the question is for an official, what do they do in light of the conflict? And so we've tried to spell out for feedback the idea that the official in those situations should come up with a mitigation plan developed in consultation with the supervisor, and the ethics panel can review that as well. So we'll go into that in more detail, but that's an important just clarification about how that works. Other updates, we're going to align with recent policies. We're going to codify that we now have annual ethics training, and we're going to incorporate that in. Clarify how rules apply to MOUs in addition to contracts, and to look at the qualifications and requirements for ethics panel service. We've also reviewed line by line with the ethics panel. Remember, that's the appointed panel that the board appoints to look at and review and issue guidance on ethics issues. And here's some additional feedback from the ethics panel that has been incorporated as well. Okay, so there are a number of definitions that are tweaked and updated. I'll highlight here that in the current version of the policy, it essentially excludes the student commissioner unless it states otherwise. We flipped that presumption. So now the student commissioner is included unless there's an express statement that they aren't excluded. We've also broadened the definition of compensation, which is important because it doesn't just apply to payment from an employer, but from any individual. And then there are a couple other definitions that we'll discuss in more detail below. So one really important definition that we've done some work on is who is covered by this policy, who is subject to the authority of the board. And here we've clarified, and this is in response to some feedback from the ethics panel, that this does not just include a business entity that enters into a contract with a board, but also an entity that is subject to significant control or impact by the policies of the board. Now, that language was in the policy previously, but a lot of people said, well, what does that mean? And so we gave some examples, or we're proposing to give some examples in the revisions. One is to include the operators of charter schools, and then other to include business entities that don't enter into a contract with city schools, but are considered partners under our community engagement policy and provide their services at a substantially reduced cost to city schools and its students. So not all partners, but really partners who otherwise would be in a fiscal relationship with us, but determined to provide their services at a reduced cost to us. We've also put some other definitions. Here are some other definitions from the model guidance that we've added. And here's some other revisions by that model guidance from the State Ethics Commission. They want us to expressly have board members and the CEO identify any relationship with the University of Maryland medical system based on some issues that have come before the State Ethics Commission and also been in the press. Also clarify ethics rules for employees who are lobbyists. And the last bullet's a really important one: prohibit retaliation against individuals for participating in an ethics investigation or in the process. You all can still see the slides, right?
No problem. Yes, we can see them.
Awesome. I did something bizarre, so I'm making sure they're still up. Okay, so we're also clarifying the application of the policy to operators, charter school operators. This is an important piece, and we want to make clear, this is already set forth, but we are clarifying this, that charter operators must develop a code of ethics for their operation that's no less robust than this policy, that the operators board members must file annual financial disclosure statements, and that the ethics panel is empowered to consult about the ethical standards that apply to operators and their board members. There are some questions that have come up about charter operators, so we wanted to put this into the policy. And this was a piece that the ethics panel particularly highlighted. Also, some more guidance to employees about secondary employment. So as it currently stands, all officials, meaning all employees and board members, must disclose secondary employment. And you can't be employed by an entity that has a financial interest and is doing business with the board. And we can't hold employment that would impair our impartiality or judgment. It's the last bullet. We just wanted to give additional guidance on what would be a employment relationship that would impair impartiality or independence of judgment. And so it would affect the usefulness of the employer and make time demands interfering with their assigned duties. So that's additional detail there, because some employees have raised, what does this mean? So this was an effort to give some clarity there. This is the point that I gestured to earlier, but we want to make sure we have clear guidance for if a conflict is identified, what does the employee do? And they come up with a mitigation plan. They're encouraged to develop a written mitigation plan to address it. They should collaborate with their supervisor, the Office of Human Capital, or the ethics panel if necessary on that. And that those mitigation plans don't excuse the officials from financial disclosure requirements. In other words, and this is important, if the ethics panel reviews a conflict, the ethics panel wants the employee or the board member to keep annually disclosing it so that it keeps up to date, so they have an ongoing record. Here are the gift rules. This is an important part of the policy, that an official may not solicit any gift or facilitate the solicitation of a gift from a lobbyist, and they can't accept gifts from someone doing business with the board, a lobbyist, or someone who has financial interests, unless, and then there are certain exceptions, right? Small gifts, meals or beverages consumed in the presence of the donor, ceremonial gifts of insignificant value. And so even in these situations, if these gifts would in some way impair the judgment, they're also prohibited. But just framing those up because this is an important part of the policy, and we've reviewed to make sure that these are consistent with current practice and they're clear. So the ethics panel, in conjunction with the board, has expanded training for ethics training. And this is just an overview of who must file disclosure statements. All those folks who file disclosure statements have to go through the training. And then in addition, members of collective bargaining units covering principals and other administrators, teachers, and school police officers must complete that annual training. And the ethics panel and the CEO can direct other individuals to complete both. So this is the overview of training. We want to codify all of this in actually the regulation here, just so it reflects this real push by the ethics panel around training. These are, and we're nearing the end here, for ethics panel members. These are the revisions. Some of them are really practice, but we wanted to codify. So ethics panel members must pass a criminal background check, there are training requirements, and there's a preference for ethics panel members who live or work in Baltimore, or they work for an entity with significant operations in Baltimore. And then they should serve, currently it's overlapping terms of right, 3 years. What we're changing is here, it currently says no member can serve more than 2 terms. We actually propose to expand it to 3 terms because we've got some very valuable expertise on that panel, and we want to build and sustain that expertise. As a side note here, if anybody, we're always looking for good panelists, so any recommendations, whether from the public or board members, we're open to that and should submit them to Tanisha Moore. Right, Tanisha?
Yes, that's a good plug. Thank you.
So in terms of stakeholder engagement, as you know, we always put this into our presentations about our plans. We've already received initial feedback from the ethics panel and the State Ethics Commission, and we're proposing, based on what the policy committee says, to reach out to PCAB, CCAC, the Charter and Operator-led School Advisory Board, the Equity Advisory Committee, ASCBC, the collective bargaining units. We're going to make sure that we have, since many of the unaffiliated employees are directly affected by the disclosure requirements and the training requirements, reaching out to them. And then finally, the PTA Council. Here, timeline, and again, I didn't want to save this to the end, but we had to submit this before we went to the ethics panel, but the good news is the ethics panel did review on June 15th and has approved the proposed revision. So again, that doesn't preclude this committee and the board from making additional revisions. We would just have to go back, and since they've already approved the lion's share, it would be a very focused review. Then here we are at policy committee. The first reader and second reader dates at the time of submission were tentative. I think the board has moved to, or in the final stages of solidifying its calendar. So hopefully those dates will be locked in and we can move forward in the process. Tanisha, what did I miss before we go to board member questions?
You covered it all. Thank you, Chief Sivan.
All right, phenomenal. So I will turn it over to my board colleagues with any questions or clarifications they seek this afternoon. Go ahead, Commissioner Esposito.
Hi. What are the areas of expertise for the ethics panel?
Generally, we're looking for individuals. So first, it's preferred that they either live in Baltimore or work for an entity that has its headquarters in Baltimore or that has significant contacts. So that's the first piece. And second is that they have some familiarity with or training on issues related to ethics. So we've had a number of people participate who are compliance officers for their own organization around these issues, or that have legal training around these issues, or in human resources, or some related chief financial officer type fields. Ms. Moore, what did I miss there in terms of what we're looking for?
Those people who, are compliance officers in their own right, like Chief Sivens said, that have some business management experience, and also some auditing experience is always good to have on the panel. It just allows us to be able to vet and go through things, having multiple ways of looking at each item. So it's helpful to have individuals with those areas of expertise.
Oh, and if someone were interested, like, is there somewhere where they could find the terms of the current members, and like, would the application typically be on our website?
So yes, great question. I'm sorry, Josh, I'll take this. Yes, the when there are vacancies that are set to arrive on the ethics panel, there is an announcement that is posted on the district's web page. And right now, currently, we do have a full 5-member panel. And on some occasions, it might be outside of the time frame if a member has to leave. But those invitations and announcements are always posted on our system's website.
And we also, when they're available, we share them with board members, I believe.
Yes.
And
yes.
I would really, the ethics panel are some of the unsung heroes of our district. They meet pretty much once a month and have advisory opinion requests that come from members. And then they look over all of our financial disclosures statements, board members. I said all of our because it's board members. It's also many school district officials, really chief level, director level, school principals, ILEDs that are subject to that annual review.
Oh, and the last question I have is for like the elected folks, like we do have like our campaign finance reports that are published publicly, but how does that factor into like what you all would consider gifts? Like, have you all talked about that at all?
There's an exception in the state ethics model guidance and in our policy for donations to campaigns, right? That's not those are covered by the campaign rules. They're not covered by these ethics rules. Although we need to be careful about the potential intersection there. We also, for elections, there is a part of the election process where candidates have to submit financial disclosures, and those are reviewed by the ethics panel actually before the election, and failure to submit one of those could constitute a disqualification of an elected member. We are also, and we should have mentioned this, but I'll just frame it. We are also talking to the city, and we included a provision in here just to make sure that as the mayor's office is vetting potential appointed candidates, there's a review, which there already is, but we just wanted to codify that for any big ethics flags. And I mean by that, not that the person, I'm sure that everybody being recommended is ethical, more that somebody has a conflict between what they do in their professional life and their interests in the board.
Thank you.
Commissioner Coyle, did you have anything you wanted to add? Looked up.
Yeah, 2 questions. The first is there an anticipated or stated, I guess, timeline for how long a review might take, right? And whether it's in the policy or as sort of somewhere where guidance is provided. But if somebody were submitting one of these for determination, how long might they expect to wait to hear back?
So I'll let Ms. Moore chime in on actual timing, but there are actually three different processes that the ethics panel engages. One is reviewing financial disclosure statements. The second is request for an advisory opinion. And the third is people can file complaints that so-and-so official has violated, and those have their own process. So there are really three different processes. And the third process, complaint, has a whole number more steps because that's a much more formal, even more formal than the other two.
Okay, yeah.
Or you want to chime in on timing?
Yeah, I was just gonna.
Oops, Tanisha, we may have lost you. You broke up.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can. Perfect.
Okay. All right. I was just going to say, for your standard advisory opinion, and what I mean by standard is if there are not follow-up questions that go back and forth, because sometimes the panel does need more information in order to provide thorough advisory opinion. So they will on occasion submit follow-up questions to the requester. But we in the policy, it says up to 60 days. A response up to 60 days. However, please note there is also a request for an expedited advisory opinion form. And that form, the only difference in that form is that it does have a date by which you would need the advisory opinion request.
And then my second question, thank you for that. I appreciate that. As it relates to the different types, right? There's three different types, Chief Fitzsimmons, that you've outlined. Is there somewhere, and I was looking for it, but didn't see it right out, so I might have missed it. Is there somewhere where it outlines what the potential responses are, right? Like what the definitions are of the different responses? I saw one place where it referenced insufficient information, but I was trying to see if it's somewhere that said these are the potential answers that might come back from any ethics panel process.
Really good question. So I think that the insufficient response piece is in the complaint, right? That there's an initial review of a complaint to determine whether it should go forward. And one is that there was insufficient information that came with the initial complaint. And that process is spelled out in terms of the option. For advisory opinion, one of the pieces that I think that we're doing in these revisions is to really flesh that out a bit. So first, we include a definition of an advisory opinion, because sometimes people scratch their head and say, what is the difference? What is an advisory opinion versus a complaint? So that really is guidance in response to a particular request. And I think we clearly authorize this idea of a mitigation plan in response. So if the the panel says, that school principal has a relative as defined by the policy. So let's say a spouse that works for a lawn mowing company, right? So sometimes the opinion the advisory opinion just says, well, that's a conflict, right? Because to have that lawn mowing company work for the school district or contract with the school district. Well, so then what's the official supposed to do about it? And that's why we were developing that language around a mitigation plan, so that then saying to either sometimes the employee will come forward and say, I'm an assistant principal, my spouse works for a lawn mowing company that wants to do business with city schools. I'm going to take steps to say that they're not going to work at my school. I'm going to have no responsibility at all in the procurement. I'm going to know nothing about it. My spouse is not involved in the procurement of the company anyway. They work only on business, and I'm just making this up, in Howard County, right? That's my mitigation plan, and that then can be submitted to the ethics panel, so that the ethics panel can say, that sounds like a good mitigation plan, or the ethics panel can simply direct the person to follow up with human capital or their supervisor to develop an appropriate mitigation plan. And I think that sort of advice around and expectations around a mitigation plan is really important to give guidance to our folks about, okay, what do you do if you have a situation like that, especially in a city like Baltimore, where it's relatively small, people have interests in other places, and we don't want to. We say this in the training, but it very well may be the case that the best lawn mowing company in the school system, in the city, actually is that lawn mowing company. So we don't want to deprive city schools necessarily of the services by the fact of one assistant principal's spouse work there, especially if there's an appropriate mitigation plan in place. Long-winded answer, I'm sorry, but I just wanted to give the type of clarity that we're trying to provide.
Appreciate that.
And let me pick up on that thread too. So like in the policy as outlined today, like for secondary employment, one of the things that is discussed is that officials may not be employed by or have a financial interest in an entity doing business with the board. And so I know we have that listed underneath secondary. I'm just trying to think about that in terms of like that also can impact people in the primary side of employment. And like that's much more so for board members versus it is other categories of employees. So I'm just curious, there can be some opportunities for challenges there, I think, in terms of like where people's tentacles, because of the nature of their work, may touch city schools. Not sure. I guess my question is like, is the way in which that's phrased, I know it's written underneath secondary employment, does that cause any preclusion for potential board members of serving in their roles in the event that happens?
Good question. And I think that the way it's framed, even though this is not always the case with board members in terms of primary or secondary, the board member service to the board for the purpose of this policy is deemed the primary. And so their other employment is deemed the secondary, even though for many of our board members in terms of time and commitment, it's the opposite. And so one of the things we were trying to clarify is, so what does that mean? And let's first assume that the entity is not doing business with the board. But one of the things that we fleshed out is that if it affects your ability to commit to the board, right, or to the that could itself be a secondary employment that would create issues or create problems. In addition, we, in terms of secondary employment, whether it's for board members or for other officials, meaning employees, there's this concept of a mitigation plan that we go back for. Like what? So for A, you've got to disclose it. Like that's the most important piece. And then B, is it possible to develop, whether through recusals, whether through sort of walls established, metaphorical walls at your other employer besides the board, whether that you can be screened off from that decision making, especially in a very big entity. So, if you're working for a Fortune 500 company, for instance, just as an example, and you're in one unit that has no touch on city schools whatsoever, but city schools happens to contact with a very different one, and you recused yourself from that, could that be a situation? And we're not involved at all in procurement. Could that be a situation that was an appropriate mitigation plan? But I think the important, hopefully, push forward is to authorize the ethics panel to not only say, this is a conflict, but then here are some steps, or here's a response. These are appropriate steps to mitigate the conflict.
Got it. Okay, thank you for the clarification. I appreciate it. I don't have anything further. Is there anything else additional here? Chief said one other quick question I had too is, like, I know we talked about the applicability for student board commissioners as that is a evolving title on our board. Are there things that, like, as this comes for to the board, that we should think about in terms of where this may impact student commissioners differently than it does our current commissioners and other folk?
Yeah, so this, I think for the first time, I believe, but don't quote me if I'm wrong, student commissioners will be expected to complete both the ethics training and a disclosure statement. So we very clearly set out the time frame for them to complete that. And presumably also, because of the way that the definition of relatives is, there will need to be some information about their parents or their guardians and their employment. So we understand those pieces. So it'll be important for us to be thinking through the appropriate support for a student board member in submitting that statement. But that becomes more important, right? Now that student board members come July 1st will have expanded voting authority. So we'll be voting on a lot more pieces that could in and of themselves create conflicts like contracts and the like. And we benchmarked with other school districts that had expanded rights, and we saw the student board members were submitting disclosure statements. So we adopted that for our city schools.
Would it be appropriate when this comes to the board for first reader to highlight that as a new category?
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. I think that wraps us up on this particular policy. So thank you so much, Chief Sivan.
Thank you.
All right, one step closer to vacation for you. All right, let's turn our attention to policy GBCA over compensation.
Good
It's Chief Wilson.
afternoon, commissioners. This is a human
Hello.
capital policy, yes, and I'm joined here by our Director of Employee Engagement, Zelda Johnson, who will be presenting about our planned updates to policy GBCA. Zelda, I pass the baton to you. We can't hear you though, Zelda. Right now it says you're on mute.
This is my constant thing I face with Teams too.
I'm sorry. I have a new
Much
computer,
better.
so I'm getting used to it. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is the board strategic policies, and this policy GBCA supports all 7 priorities. However, it directly relates to priority 2, 5, and 7. This policy also impacts all employees of city schools. Next slide. Our goals in updating policy GBCA. There are a number of goals in updating this policy. However, we focus on ensuring the policy complies with bargaining agreements and it aligns with our procedures. We also wanted to streamline the policy and incorporate it into one, which involves eliminating the administrative regulations. And finally, we are, through the proposed revisions, we are implementing annual increases for unaffiliated staff, comparable as negotiated by the unions. Next slide. Our compensation philosophy values. A compensation philosophy, it formally documents an organization's position on employee compensation. It is the why behind the employee's pay and creates a framework for consistency. After reviewing other Maryland LEA's compensation philosophies, we drafted one for city schools. And in the 17 years that I've worked for Human Capital, this is the first time we've even discussed a philosophy during this policy process. Some of the values are equity, fairness, and transparency, amongst others. Next slide. Based on these values and research, this is a draft of the compensation philosophy, so we can read it out loud. And I want to propose that if I can ask Commissioner Sally, if he could read the first bullet for me.
Sure. We value the collective work and contributions of all employees at city schools.
And I will go to the next slide. I'm sorry, not the next slide, the next bullet. We support a fair, equitable, and consistent approach to compensation for all employees. And we also strive to provide a competitive overall compensation package. After this presentation, I would love to hear some feedback from the commissioners, if you don't mind. Next slide, please. Policy GBCA, new definitions added. We decided to create definitions for this policy to align our policy with other policies such as GBN and our internal protocols. These include new definitions such as job class, position, reclassification, and reorganization. Next slide, please. Position descriptions. This slide will clarify that the Office of Human Capital will develop position descriptions that include qualification standards and allow us to review salaries and benefit schedules for all positions consistent with the bargaining agreements. In other words, we are working to have more transparency and to standardize what's in each job description. Next slide, please. Compensation setting process. Once the position description is created, we set compensation using this process. Position descriptions and job titles are created and reviewed to determine union affiliation and salary scale placement. Salaries are set for individuals based on the requirements included in each job description and the relevant education and work experience of the individual. The pay scales and compensation setting and salary progressions are negotiated by each union as well. We can go to the next slide. Unaffiliated compensation. This one is a huge shift. We are in the process of adding provisions to unaffiliated compensation. This includes unaffiliated employees receiving the same annual increase as negotiated by the unions of comparable roles. The compensation schedule for unaffiliated employees will be recommended by the CEO or the CEO's designee in accordance with existing personnel procedures for board approval. The CEO or the CEO's designee will update the board on progress towards the implementation of interval movement salary progression until the process for annual movements based on evaluations is finalized. And this was recommended because for years, unaffiliated employees were not receiving annual increases as other employees that were in unions or in union positions. Next slide. Position class reclassification. We are redefining reclassification as the act of changing the classification of a role after the job description is updated. This may or may not have an impact on both the job title and the pay scale. So reclassification provides a fair and equitable means to evaluate whether to adjust the grades or the classification and or compensation for eligible employees. This typically occurs after a compensation study or significant change in the job duties and or the level of responsibilities for the position. We want to make sure our policy is clear as to what a reclassification really is. Once the request is submitted, it must be approved by the chief. Next slide. Reorganization. We are also defining reorganization as the act of changing the structure of a unit, a department, or an org. Which included in shifts in the number of roles of employees as well as their reporting structure. Reorganization typically takes place during the annual budget process, and that's every year. This process is intended to promote increased effectiveness of city schools and shall not be utilized as a substitute for reclassification, nor the primary purpose to be used to address performance concerns of employees impacted in a reorg. In this process, employees impacted will receive timely notifications, and HC will make available information concerning options for affected employees to apply to open positions. Next slide. Additional revisions to policy GBCA. Other additional revisions to this policy will clarify that employees serving in an interim and acting assignments will receive salary adjustments in accordance with policy GBN. It will also highlight those employees returning from a long-term leave of absence that will have a salary placement in accordance with provisions of their specific leave category. It shall also provide additional information regarding the salary placement for former employees of city schools and specify that employees may raise claims of discrimination based on pay in accordance with our non-discrimination policies and regulations. And that other concerns or questions about compensation they should always be directed to the Office of Human Capital. And we can go to the next slide. Our stakeholder engagement. We propose revisions, our proposed revisions, will be shared with stakeholders over the next several months. We plan to conduct feedback sessions to inform and collect feedback from our unaffiliated employees. And the proposed stakeholders are listed. That's the Parent and Community Advisory Board, along with charter and operator-led school advisories, the Equity Advisory Committee, PTA Council, Associated Student Congress of Baltimore, and all employees, including unaffiliated, will be able to provide us with feedback. And that's the end of our presentation.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ms. Johnson. I really appreciate your leadership on the presentation. So I turn it to my board colleagues with questions.
I do have a question or two, but maybe I'll just start by saying, obviously, this work is enormous and is so critical. And as you look at from any number of perspectives, the number of people, the number of different locations, the percent of the budget, like, doesn't matter how you look at it. What we're talking about here and the work that you do, Ms. Johnson and Chief Nelson, is sort of significant. So with that, you know, it's also something that can be very emotional. You know, a lot of folks, yeah, it's a very, like, when people come with concerns or questions, it feels very personal. It feels very like they're coming, and by the time they're arriving at you, I can only imagine that the sort of energy is built up in a way, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Which is a long way of saying this work, getting it right, you know, is obviously really important. You know, and thinking about how do we measure and understand some of these different things that like, what does it mean to get right? And I really appreciate all that. It's obvious that you've been putting into this and the work that relates to it. One of the compliance reports, or a question about compliance reports that I have, is there a report? And admittedly, I've not been through enough of a full cycle perhaps to see this, but that would indicate, is there a compliance report that would indicate the number of employees who have filed a complaint about reclassification or reorganization or other compensation related process? Does that exist?
That's a great question. Not to my knowledge. I can follow up with you, though, to see if we do have something that we can pull.
Yeah, I'd really appreciate that, and sort of understanding the volume, the degree, sort of for those. And the second question that's related to this is there a report that would indicate the response and resolution rate, or response time and resolution rate for some of the salary review requests or other, like when an individual either has met certain criteria and should be paid more based off of, let's say, they complete a degree, and so now they are in a new, they should be paid at a new level, or they've completed different requirements. Is there, yeah, I guess, is there a way to verify or know or see how we are doing about reviewing and then implementing those changes in their pay and compensation?
That's a great question as well. We can follow up with you and just to make sure that we have everything complete and to answer your question thoroughly.
And then a third question, if I may, Commissioner Sally.
Sure, please.
I noticed in here it references, but very, very sort of, you know, there are a lot of other things in this as well, but it was a very short reference to timeliness of pay, or to the payment process being managed. It sort of was referenced that it's managed by finance. my question, though, as it relates to this broader question in our policy around compensation, is just trying to understand the degree to which they're like I know I've heard different statements to that effect, but it's hard to have insight into the volume in terms of the number of instances and distinguish that sometimes from the volume or the sort of the degree to which certain instances are elevated and that they are lifted up. You know, in other words, are there sometimes issues that are more singular but are repeated, or are there many issues and we're only hearing a few of them? Is sort of the signal that I don't feel like I have enough insight to be able to determine.
So you're referring to the timeliness of paying employees?
Yeah, just so you know, I've heard at different times in different ways concerns about that, but what I don't understand or don't know is to what degree is that a few and isolated, or to what degree is that more and more common, right? Like, where does that fall in there? And this could be, I mean, a part, I guess it's it might be in some sort of compliance report or some sort of report. We're just trying to understand the degree to which or not that is happening.
Okay.
Ms. Johnson, correct me if I'm wrong, like those are two different processes, right? Like here we're talking about compensation policy, right? Like we're not talking about the actual transfer policy, because those are two different divisions. Payroll is separate than compensation. Yes. So I just want to make sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but I just want to make sure we are drawing the right delineation between like what this policy does, and there's a clear handoff from like what the Office of Human Resource does versus what payroll actually does. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, compensation and payroll are really two different functions. We set the salaries and payroll pays the employees.
And Commissioner, that's a great point. I appreciate you pointing that out. Is there a comparable policy that relates to the financial side, or does this policy sort of span that full? Understand that it's very, you know, that obviously Ms. Johnson, Chief Nielsen would not be responsible for that, but is there somewhere else where it would outline some of the policy related to that, or is it really just that expectation is then, you know, contained within this policy, even if the function is handled by a different division?
I don't think there's a related policy. It's more procedures for payroll. Mm-hmm. This policy does reference that human capital sets compensation, payroll executes on paying it. I think to your earlier question, though, we have a pretty good track record of paying people on time, their standard pay. What can be tricky is when pay changes from year to year. And in addition to just the mechanical changes of, you know, if a union has negotiated an increase, getting that processed, if the contract negotiations take longer or don't get ratified as quickly, there can be a delay there. And then we have a pretty complicated system by which our teachers can advance their pay with the AU system right now. And with the 3 different ways that they can earn AUs, does contribute to how long it takes before that is fully updated in the system to pay teachers. And you may have been hearing some comments about that recently.
Yeah, and I think that does get at sort of the underlying part of the question. And, you know, I certainly sort of appreciate that there are different folks involved in this, absolutely. And I think as a district in total, you know, what ultimately those getting paid care about is that the money does end up in their account. So thinking through like where and how do we have that insight? And to your point about the like that it's relatively few, or that like certain parts, you know, understanding what that is would be greatly appreciated, just to be able, as a commissioner, to say like, yes, this is, although it needs to be addressed and it's a deep concern for those impacted, you know, is it 1% sort of the, you know, staff are affected by this, or is it 10%? Is it 50%? Like, you know, just knowing that some of those things would be helpful in understanding in understanding. So,
Okay,
And because this is a function that maybe it's separate, right? Like there is the policy implication part and the actual mechanical parts of actually putting compensation into place may be separate than what this policy governs or what the work of the Office of Human Capital is. Let's allow Chief Nielsen a little bit of like space to fulfill that request or to hand it off to the right folks, just because it is a little bit separate here. Is that right, Chief Nielsen? I just want to make sure we're not.
Yes, I'm
putting you
actually
on-
preparing an update for BTU at our JOC meeting later this week about what are all of the components that go into updating salaries for BTU members for the next year and what are the time constraints. And I'd be happy to brief board members on that if that's of interest.
wonderful. Yeah, no, and I totally appreciate, the multiple divisions that are involved in this. So yes, Commissioner Sally, I'm happy to give that the time it needs.
Yeah, and that way, like, we're not conflating like what the compensation policy does versus like what you're addressing here, which is a little bit separate, which is like ensuring that once a raise actually goes through or salary adjustment actually is approved from whatever union negotiation, that actually that transpires in a timely, meaningful way. So we just want to separate the two from what we're talking about. But Chief Nielsen can follow up on that request.
Those are a lot of my questions there. I thank you for letting me ask as many as I did.
No problem. Commissioner Esposito?
Hi. So my question's about the the reclassification. Is there a temporary reclassification or like an acting capacity for employees that take on duties temporarily that are like outside of their scope of work? Or say, for example, like I know we've heard testimony in the past, like teachers that are filling in for multiple classes, like if there's a vacancy, but it's not like a long enough period of time where they would I guess I'm sure like by the time they did the whole reclassification process, they would have passed those duties on, but for the time that they are doing that coverage, is there anything like that?
I just want to pause to recognize that reclassification is when a role is changing. We do have a procedure for acting, interim, and out of title pay for every single union and unaffiliated, so that if there is a vacancy or if someone is not serving in a role because they're somehow incapacitated, there is a procedure for people to get extra pay for that. What I believe you're referencing, though, is about teachers covering for other teachers who are absent or who, if there's a vacancy.
Or any position that's like they're equal, like the same work, but just the volume is bigger. So it wouldn't necessarily be like an upward duty.
So acting, interim, and out of title is typically for if there's someone above you who's not serving in that capacity. For teachers, that's really governed by our BTU contract.
Okay. And so for folks that, never mind. Thank you.
That is a good question, and your questions are really illuminating the both yours and Commissioner Coy's sort of what this policy covers and what, even though compensation is a very broad topic, this policy doesn't cover.
Okay. Yeah, and then the other. Oh,
can I offer something up, Commissioner Esposito, while we're on that? That may be helpful to illuminate that. I like it. Makes it very clear for the public what does this cover and what does this not cover. And so to the extent when you're looking back at this presentation before it comes before first reader, it may be helpful to delineate a couple of things just so that it makes it crystal clear what we're discussing here.
Thank you.
I think it's an overall pretty good presentation, but to the extent where you can find opportunities to do that, I think it'll help make sure that everybody's operating from the same playbook.
Thank you for that feedback.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Esposito, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, and the other question that I have is, as far as benefits, like, would that also fall under the BTU contract negotiations, or is that, I'm trying to remember which slide, I think it was one of the earlier slides, talking about mapping out like everybody's salary, like the salaries, benefits, like, is that part of this or is that separate?
benefits are part of our total rewards.
Okay.
And the compensation philosophy does speak to our total rewards, and compensation is a big one of them, but it's not the only one. Our benefits, our time off, our tuition reimbursement, all these things are encompassed under the idea of total rewards. But yes, each of the unions do negotiate their package of compensation for their members.
Okay, and I know you mentioned that like a way for someone to raise concerns is discrimination, but is there a mechanism like that doesn't fall under discrimination, but maybe like an employee that needs an accommodation or an exception in the way that the rules are applied? And I can give an example. So say there's two teachers, they have maternity leave, and the way that they would like to take it is like together at the same time, and wanted to like put in like an exception for their situation, like whether it's like childcare. Is there something other than like discrimination to
So
like
I
raise
think
the
you're
concern?
referencing what is allowed under FML for a couple who are both employed by the same
Right.
employer. And
Mhm.
so that is driven by the federal Family Medical Leave Act. And so we administer the provisions of that law.
Okay.
So there are you for one reason of leave, like the birth of a child, you get the 12 weeks. And so there are particular situations when you can get more time, like if the mother's health requires it for another reason of like her personal health, but that's why the specific occurrence of the need for the FML is the birth of a child, that there would be splitting. But our leave analyst, Felicia Cooper, walks people through this when they are in that specific situation. And in fact, we've been working on some additional FML resources, some on-demand videos in addition to the print materials that's on the site to better meet staff's needs to understand what FML can and can't do for them.
Okay. And is there a process like to raise like a request for like accommodations or like an exception? Like, because I mean, I've been in a similar situation where, you know, I had leave, but my specific medical situation fell into a gray area in the way that the federal policy was written. So is there a way for someone to raise that within our system?
Well, there's certainly the accommodation process under ADA and EEO, but that our Office of Legal Counsel administers that team. We do have, I mean, we follow FML. This policy doesn't actually deal with leaves of absence, which are covered elsewhere.
And I think that's an important point. Like, so, you know, we want to, well, those questions are really important, Commissioner Esposito. I think those are better saved for like policy adjustments related specifically to those policies, because here we're focusing on compensation. So like when we're looking across the broad human capital spectrum, right? Like, you know, we're looking at one slice here. Well, there are some dotted lines, you know, to benefits and other things like that. I think we're focusing on this one particular slice. I'm not sure. I guess maybe the better question is like it like to Commissioner Esposito's point is, will those policies come before policy or the board this year? Chief Nielsen.
Well, not this year that we're finishing, and they're not on the calendar for the coming year.
Okay.
But they could be at another point
in time.
And I think Josh might have some additional clarification.
Sure. So we are waiting for a third reader on the policies on non-discrimination, so we can look at, and those already address discrimination based on marital status, on pregnancy, so we can look at that to clarify. But I'm not aware, and I may be missing something, about any prohibition on two spouses taking FMLA together, and we will work to clarify that.
Yeah, and I guess like my brain, like where my brain's at is our previous meeting, like talking about like the ethics panel, like having a mechanism where you can ask for, like, say, hey, this situation's weird. Like, can we get like a closer look at it.
And believe me, folks definitely reach out to the EEO office on those pieces. And then I think what they won't tout their own horn, so I'm going to tout Zelda and Ms. Johnson and Ms. Nielsen's horns directly, is that part of this policy is really trying to clarify what's a reclassification, what's a reorganization, and what's a salary review, and define clear processes for each. And then they've done extraordinary work then also at the level of the standard operating procedures there. So I've just lifted up all the great work that they've done, and then the policy reflecting that, that we have these different pieces, because I think even internally there was often some confusion about what's what. So this is a big step forward to clarify. Is that fair?
Yeah, Zelda's team has done a lot of work to not only continue executing, but to document what they're doing so that we can have greater transparency to all of our employees. And that is one of the goals of this policy update, that we're also putting a stake in the ground to say that we commit to doing this, because we don't think compensation should be in the dark. We respect individuals' privacy, but there is a lot more information, especially about procedures, that we can and should share, and that this policy has provoked us to find a way to do that.
Commissioner Esposito, do you have anything additional for this team?
Oh, no. Yeah, but thank you for answering the questions. This is definitely like complicated.
Yeah, and it is. And like, I think, to the point that Josh was just raising, as well as this discussion, I know customers don't always like think about like how their entry point, it's not always very clear for them when they have some challenges. And so, I know that is the work of the Office of Human Capital, is to really clarify where those opportunities are for them to like address things that impact their lives as well as like their professional lives. One thing, Ms. Johnson, I give you, I think maybe a point of feedback that I think may be helpful for the public too, is thinking about how we provide very clear definitions of what an unaffiliated employee is and how they're impacted by this policy. I didn't see that in here, but I think to the extent that we pull that out a little bit earlier versus what we made by folks who are covered by collective bargaining agreements, I think that may be helpful for the public. And also to the extent that we're super uber clear about the role of collective bargaining in compensation policy. And I know we don't want to get too far down in the weeds, but I think some of that will be illuminating in terms of, as we've continued to talk about this year, is like the role of the board, as well as the role of CEO's designee who handles collective bargaining. So just kind of creating the linkages and lineages for people to see that all kind of coming together. I don't know if that's appropriate, but I offered that out there for your consideration.
Well, thank you for that feedback.
And Commissioner Sally, maybe one other point. I mean, and you said this, Ms. Johnson, in your comment, but the fact that the unaffiliated employee class is receiving annual steps, I think is like, that's the proposal is pretty massive, right? Like that's a lot. That's a big deal. And while it may not make the most sense to like have that be sort of triple underscored in the meeting, perhaps the thing to underscore is that they weren't getting that before, and that these other collective bargaining units had so much more of that. There could be something, but I'll let you all decide how much you want to lift that up. But I just, when you said that, that was like, wow, that's a big deal, changing that. And I think it's the right thing to do. Just saying, like, whether you want to lift that up as much or not, I'll let you all decide.
Thank you.
And in summary, to just build on that, I think just to pull out the three different parts that you're covering in the very, very beginning, like what this is and what this isn't, I think it'll make it very clear what we're trying to accomplish here in these revisions may be helpful.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think one of the things that would help me like visual, like kind of like how we're raising these issues and it's like, oh, it falls under this, like this category, maybe like in the beginning having something like of the pieces of compensation, salary, benefits, like which things fall under like which, like basically like who manages it, so that yeah, I think visually it would have helped me like narrow my focus.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure that they're covering the right wheel, like the right part of the wheel of human capital. So like, I
Right.
think to the extent that they can do that for compensation, I think that makes sense. But I know I've seen like kind of charts before from the Office of Human Capital, all the things that they manage, but like one slice of the wheel, what does that look like? I think that may make sense, but we don't want to go too far across the entire wheel. I call it a wheel. That's probably not the right word and term. I don't have anything else for Ms. Johnson or Chief Nielsen, but I think this is phenomenal. We appreciate the work. We look forward to seeing this shape up and come for first reader.
Well, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Have a good evening, and we appreciate your time.
You do the same.
Appreciate the feedback.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you, guys. All right, we want to do compliance reports next. So we only have one compliance report on the docket for today. So we want to make sure our colleagues have any questions about the compliance report that we have on media relations. That's KDD. And Chief, I'm sorry, Andre Riley is here covering the comm shop for any questions that our colleagues may have.
I am here also, Commissioner Sally. It's Tina Highcover. Just transitioning from the car to the house, so apologize, but I'm here.
We hit the lotto with two folks from your office today. My colleagues have any questions about anything covered here?
So I took a minute to toggle between the two. Yeah, so I mean, it's obviously a pretty short compliance report, but just highlighting that there were less than 10 instances. Maybe one of my questions, though, as you were thinking about those instances, was there, of those 10, were there any that would not have been approved if they were requested, right? Were there any that were sort of like, this was not only didn't go through the right process, but we wouldn't have approved that had it come through the process? Does that distinction make sense?
It does. And to your question, Commissioner Coy, no. All of them would have been approved. It was just following the process that we've laid out. For instance, we'll have a school that will reached out to me and said, well, I've got WJZ coming. Is that okay? And we prefer you to ask us ahead of time, just so we know, in case there's something that the school may not be aware of, whether it be from the story or sometimes we have very good reasons to say that. But yeah, fortunately, we didn't have any that we would have outright have rejected. It's just process.
I think we looked it up before too, Andre. This is just coming back to me. It may have been a year or so ago, where we were talking about, and I know you touched on this in the report, is about the training opportunities and finding the right opportunities for folks to be aware of that. So at all levels of the system. So, what are the right intervals? Like, what are the modules that you push them to, the resources you push them to? If you can talk through that, I think is really important.
Absolutely. Our training, we've taken a pretty broad-based approach, except for dedicated audiences. The broad-based approach is making sure that there's information in the employee newsletter, at least once a quarter, that just reminds individuals of the existence of the policy. And it's basic tenet, just check with comms. Send an email to comms at communications@bcps.k12.md.us. And that's how you can reach out. We usually solve anything pretty quickly. However, we want to continue to focus on our groups like principals, athletic directors, where we have large groups of folks that may have a little bit more interaction than, let's say, your rank and file employee. And for those instances, we like to meet with them at least once a year. We try to teach principals at the beginning of the year. Because initially, when we get those requests for media interaction, that's where they come from. They rarely come from a teacher or a specialist level employee. They come from the building head. So we want the building head to know. And for our athletic directors, they have a unique place in how they communicate with the media. You're not going to reach out to me at the end of a baseball game and say, hey, wait a minute, before I give you this post-game interview, let me call communications. We really don't want you to have to do that. However, we want to set up a framework where be careful when you're speaking about students' academic history, when you're speaking about students' health, concerns, like if somebody has, I'll just throw out some random thing, sickle cell, I'm not certain we want you to say that. That's a HIPAA related matter. But it's another to say, well, he injured his ankle apparently in the middle of a game. I mean, the world could see that. Yeah, the student he's injured himself and we're getting medical care. So those are the two groups that we've really focused on. Everybody else usually just gets broad-based reminders.
And has Piazza raised any concerns or opportunities for the media office in regards to this?
They have not. However, as we prepare to bring back some potential revisions to the policy later this year, our larger concern is still around First Amendment rights. The rights of our staff we do not have the right to say you can't speak to media. We could just frame in what instances it would be most effective, and have that difference between when you're speaking as an employee and when you're speaking as yourself. So as we developed, we've not heard anything from Piazza, but we're going to work with our friends in the Office of the Legal Counsel to try to bring back some clarifications that we think will impact everybody. As far as will bring clarity to when you can speak and when you shouldn't.
Got it. And Commissioner Esposito, did you have any questions for the team? You're on mute.
Yeah, I was thinking. Because I did have one, but I lost it. What was it? Oh, are there any opportunities for you all to help facilitate like the schools, like say for example, like a school wants to like write an op-ed? Is that information also put out there? Because yeah, like because I think I reached out, I'm trying to remember what I reached out to y'all for. I think it was like assistance with something that I had to speak at. But yeah, like those types of opportunities rather than like the reactive, like saying like, oh, the media is coming.
Yes, we do have opportunities if schools want to submit, like you said, an op-ed or encourage media just to come out and cover some of their great work. The process is still the same. Just reach out to communications, indicate what you would like to do. And through our media relations manager, Sherry Christian, myself and the rest of the communications team will facilitate it. If you want media to come out, we can invite them. We've got lots of great relationships. If you want to write a piece, we have reviewed individual pieces for employees to make certain that they're speaking for themselves and not the district, as well as to make them more attractive, more likely to get picked up by media outlets or get placed. So we want to be open. We want to let folks know we're here to help you. Your successes tend to be our successes.
Phenomenal.
Well, while I don't know if this belongs exactly in a compliance report, I also just, in terms of successes, lifting up the number and the different outlets that have featured city schools. I'm thinking of, the kids section in the New York Times that had, written comments from students in Baltimore City Schools, and thinking about a number of other times that City Schools has been highlighted for good in a variety of publications. I wonder if there's somewhere where a reflective sort of like, here's some of the greatest stories from the past year could be kind of an interesting, again, not necessarily a compliance report, although maybe that's a good place for it, but certainly in terms of, I think you could do some retrospective on the year and lifting up these great stories from the past year.
There are ways. I'm glad you said that, because we're doing 3 distinctive things to generate that result. I don't know if you visited our website recently or some of our social media postings, but we have a visual version of our Good News Report where we show links and clips of great things our schools are doing, as well as coverage that we get from the media. We're also working to revamp our progress report webpage so it keeps a running archive of all this good news, which we can then highlight in our newsletters, again, on social media, and other ways where we can celebrate the wins of the district. And also at the leadership level, we do generate a weekly good news report. I believe the board may not be receiving that, but I can make it happen if you're not receiving it, or if there's something in there that you want to see. So when we have a great story about our young lady last week who was raising money for homeless students, and we got that featured, I believe, on WMAR. I think that's where we're at. I want to celebrate those great stories. We got a lot of great stories to tell in Baltimore City Public Schools, and we do keep a running list per our chief.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm going to get to Commissioner Esposito's quick point, and then we'll move on through for public comment. Go ahead, Commissioner Esposito.
Are there any, this isn't necessarily compliance related, but it just like popped in my head. Like, are there any plans to have like commercials like promoting city schools? And the reason why I ask is like as a toddler parent and also, you know, a school expert person that was like in nonprofit work had mentioned the need for toddler parents to know about the school system like in advance, like at least have some type of awareness of it or like what's going on with it. So I don't know if there's any way to like promote it in advance.
There is, to the group that you're speaking of, the folks before they had arrived in our school district, we're working with Executive Director Crystal Francis and her team in early learning to come up with ways to embrace that community more with targeted advertising, to your point. We have a limited amount of funds, so we're going to figure out what are the best ways to do it. So you probably won't see us on TV, but you may see us at a bus stop. You may see us on social media, but I can't guarantee you a billboard. It's just a matter of taking the limited funds that we have and getting the most use out of them.
And I guess like the other option too, like I didn't know until recently that we had our own TV station. So maybe even promoting that like in itself might help.
We think so, especially as we start to branch out beyond Comcast, where the station's located. Right now, if you're a Comcast subscriber, you see it. We're working on a smart TV app and some other means that even if you're not paying Comcast, you can watch our content. And you guys should be seeing that soon enough, especially as you reconstitute the Stroudsburg board and we tell you about it.
I appreciate that, Andre. I think like the comms arm is really
Speaking of commercials, there's one.
All right, thank you so much, Andre. We appreciate that. Thank you, Chief Highcomber. All right, so public comment. We didn't receive any public comments in advance or requests for public comment in advance of today's meeting. I open it up to the general public if there are any comments or questions this afternoon. Hearing none, I think that brings us to the end of our agenda today. Our staff has a couple of follow-ups in regards to the two presentations that we looked at today in advance of our first reader. We're not reconvening until August 15th of 2023, but it gives us a little bit of time and reprieve, and our staff time and reprieve to enjoy the summer. And I want to thank both of my two commissioners as well as the staff for just your exceptional support and work over school year 22-23, and I'm looking forward to school year 23-24. So, there's one quick comment before I adjourn here. Let me see what it is here.
Oh, you're talking about a comment. I was just giving a thumbs up to what you were saying.
Okay, all right. All right, I think that's it. No, there is a comment about wanting to know if school closure policy will be discussed again soon. So that particular policy, I believe, has already gone forward for vote at the last school board meeting. So that is not going to be revisited this school year, which is closing. It may be back on the docket for next year, but we're in the process of publishing our calendar for next school year. So stay tuned. That should be out in the next month or so. think that's all I have. I hope you guys all have a good rest of your week, and we'll talk soon. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you guys. Thanks, Tanisha. I appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye-bye, guys.